My name is Rachael Ray. I'm the Director of Research here, and the main role I played in the flood was helping build the intake forms and make sure that eligible households got what they needed, and the ones that weren't eligible didn't get a check. I did have a couple come in, and they had been determined ineligible because of their income. Their house was flooded. They were displaced. They had lost a lot of the things that they own. But we were really trying to capture low-income people who would potentially be homeless due to the flood. And so their income exceeded the income level we needed. They didn't have children, they weren't disabled, they weren't elderly. And they came in and they were kind of like, what's going on? Our neighbor got assistance, we didn't. They were obviously very upset, very heavily impacted, almost in tears. And I just had to explain to them, we have eligibility criteria, and unfortunately you make more money than our income limit allows. So they were like, but we don't know where we're gonna live, we might have to move out of the area, what are we supposed to do? And it was just really hard. It's really hard to have to say to someone, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do for you. I don't know if ultimately they got help. The woman was not working due to some health issues, but she was very reluctant to claim that she had a disability. So by the time I kind of wrapped up with them, they still hadn't received much assistance.
So I met Robert, who was wearing a t-shirt that was a little bit soiled, like he had brushed up against something, and there was some dirt on it a little bit, but it caught my attention because you could see through the silhouette of his t-shirt that he had, you know, kind of like an abscess or a boil or something that was kind of sticking out from his t-shirt. And I asked him if he was okay, if he maybe needed to change a dressing, or you could tell like he had been injured. And he shared with me that he has cancer. He's been living with cancer for the last couple of years, and I asked him, as part of the intake process, we kind of asked him some questions about, you know, if there's ever a time when he doesn't feel good, but that he doesn't want to go and get help, was one of the questions. And in that conversation, we opened up this dialogue about how his doctor has recommended that he go and get surgery because that's the only other option for his cancer to go away. But he's not willing to go and get the surgery because he's been living in the creek, which is a very kind of dirty environment, and he felt like if I go get the surgery, even though it's going to be covered by my insurance, I won't be able to climb down back into the creek and then climb back out when I need to get food and that kind of thing, and it's not a very sanitized environment for somebody who's recovering from surgery. So he decided that it just wasn't going to be the time, and then next thing you know, the flood happened, which he lost all of his bedding that was clean enough so that he would be able to change his dressings and such. He lost his medical supplies, his gauze and all those things that was helping him kind of deal with these boils and these sores that were on him, and he didn't know what to do. So we did our best to be able to, one, get him some gift cards, two, be able to, you know, plug him in with some of the essential services here, but three, and perhaps most importantly, get him to, you know, have somebody that he can talk to, and get him, you know, plugged in with medical services that would maybe present some other options during a transition period for him. So that was a pretty intense story. That was one of those ones where I really took it home with me at night.
My name is Annette, and my part of the process was handing out checks to those that are housed and gift cards to the homeless folks that came in for flood relief. And the first thing that really struck me was just how exhausted people are, that this has taken so much out of them, trying to recover from losing so much, and really having to go to multiple agencies, different places to get relief, and it was really a big process for them, really hard. One woman, I gave her a check, and she burst into tears, and her two daughters that were with her both started crying, and they were all hugging me. And I know that this check that they received is not enough to recover the things that they lost, but they were so grateful for just that little bit that they got. One gentleman that was homeless, when I handed him gift cards, he also burst into tears and just told me his story about being incarcerated for 1.5 years and then living on the street for the last 2 years and not being able to see his children And the multiple times that he's been robbed, and a lot of the homeless folks did talk about that it's so hard to hang on to what little they do have. And he was just incredibly grateful for this little help that we were able to give him.
Jill Mitch, Funds Development Manager. I was one of the Sacred Heart staff members who was working directly with flood victims. I remember it was the first weekend where we were giving out checks for families who were impacted by the flood, and there was this man named Paul, and you could just tell he was very just nervous and antsy, and we told him, you know, your money went through. We gave him this check, and he was so relieved because he just had his wife and his 6-week-old daughter were waiting in the car for him, and he said, you know, I've worked really hard to rebuild my life, and I wasn't expecting something like this to happen. And I mean, I can't imagine what it's like to have an infant, so to deal with this and have a baby, you could tell that just the stress was wearing on him. And our volunteer said, hey, do you need diapers? Do you need a formula? And we were able to set him up with that too, and just help relieve some stress for him. And I'm really glad that we were able to help him that little bit.
My name is Lily Tapia. I'm the Director of Essential Services here at Sacred Heart. I was part of working with a flood team. We have been working with the flood since March 2nd. While working with our unhoused population, the most impactful part was how many layers of challenges they've had. It's either their environment, it is their personal health, it is the types of support systems that they've had. One of the biggest impact on me was one of the first people that I helped in the gift card distribution. Her name is Angela, and she is a transgender woman, male to female. She was a flood victim who was living in her car, and her car was flooded. She's also a parent of a child with Down syndrome, and every time I asked a question, she had a story about the question. And for my own personal self-care, I kept reminding people this is a yes, no, or refuse to answer questions, but she just needed to have time to express herself and why she was answering the way she was. And Angela just had so many layers to her story. It was sexual abuse, it was domestic violence, it was homelessness, it was being a single parent, it was lack of support systems, and it was really a difficult story to hear, only because it was hard for me to feel like the services that I have to offer on a day-to-day basis, including the flood relief funds, was going to be so minimal to help support her overall needs. And she's really stuck out to me as somebody who can help drive me to do more and be better for our neighbors.
My name is Terry West, and I'm the Outreach Manager here at Sacred Heart. And I've been working on the flood relief help here since I think about the first week of March. Initially, we got a list of about 300 addresses that the city had given us that were approved for flood help. We received so many applicants, and we took so much information, and it's much to, I say, Pancho and the other directors' credit that we kept just collecting as much information that we could and sending more and more addresses back to the city, that I think we ended up helping close to 800 different households. We came up against so many different challenges of, you know, people renting rooms and people living in studios that weren't actually really studios, people thinking that they were on a lease that they weren't really on, and the city not recognizing that they were, you know, there were sometimes 4 or 5 families living in a 1-bedroom apartment, you know, in one of the poorest areas in the city, which was unfortunate that they didn't recognize that that was going to be a problem. So we were actually able to get a second round of funding, which was great because we were able to give, you know, the second and third families in these small apartments, you know, a little bit of cash that would help them. But it was heartbreaking. You know, I was serving, or, you know, helping men that were like in my father's age, in their 80s, you know, wondering where they were going to get their oxygen tank that this woman usually brought them, or wondering if they were going to sleep, and trying to communicate with us that they really needed help and that they felt lost and forgotten. And it was really difficult. It was really heartbreaking. And you know, it's no coincidence that the poorest part of town was impacted by the flood. And I've been here for 10 years, and I've worked with you know, a low-income community for about 20 years. But you know, talking to people like 12 and 13 hours a day was just, you know, I think it made all of our hearts hurt, because we couldn't do much except for, you know, we're going to process this application and we'll get back to you, or, you know, come back in 3 days and we'll see if your application's approved. I think we were all thrilled that we were able to help more people than the city had initially told us that we could, but I don't think anybody felt like it was enough. When we got to the part of the funding where we were told we could help some of our customers that lived outside, we were told we could only give them gift cards, which was really hard to tell people. You know, they were physically swept away by water and lost everything they owned. And the application process was much different. We had to ask them some really personal and, you know, quite intrusive questions about, you know, their prison record, their drug use, their assault record, you know, whether they'd been abused, whether domestic violence was part of their lives. And I had to force myself to ask the questions in the first few days. And it was it was hard to stomach, because a lot of people were just so used to answering questions like that they just, the answers just kind of like rolled off their tongues. And it was like they were so used to being treated as though, you know, they didn't matter. And I kept saying, I'm so sorry I have to ask you these questions. You know, it's just a form we have to go through. And some people wouldn't make eye contact with us at all. And I think some people were happy to have someone to speak to. One day I spent 3.5 hours doing intake, and I only spoke to 2 gentlemen. And they just sobbed the entire time, because I think they were just happy to have some maybe human, you know, communication, telling their story, or maybe someone listened to them finally. And then there were days where I would, you know, get through 25 people, and the questions didn't even seem to faze them, which wasn't okay, because you know, they were doing what they had to do to receive the gift cards. But it was hard when someone said, yes, I've been abused and I've been sexually assaulted, kind of like, next question. And I wasn't really leaving them with anything except for, you know, come back in 3 days and see if I can get you a gift card. I felt like I should have been able to say, you know, can I get you some counseling, or can I, you know, have you talk to someone, or, you know, can I give you a hug, or, you know, I left here feeling pretty broken every day. But in the grand scheme of things, you know, the end of my day was great compared to watching people leave, you know, like ride their bike back off into the rain. So it was hard. It was really rough to do that all day long for so long, and just realize that that there are so many people. It's an entire community of people that have just become used to living that way. And like, we've all gotten used to it too. The whole city has just accepted that we have this group of people that like live off in the bushes and live in the overpasses, and we didn't find them important enough to give them money. We gave them gift cards, and they seemed okay with it, and it wasn't okay. And I think all of us are still trying to figure out how to process it.
My name is Emily Kahn. I am the Jesuit volunteer who is working as a community engagement coordinator in the volunteer office. I get to spend a lot of time talking to people. My major responsibility throughout all of our flood programs was to kind of run and organize the intake waiting area. So I had an opportunity to talk to a lot of different families and individuals, and one story that sticks out in my mind is a couple who I spoke to in the waiting area. and then ended up also helping fill out their application. And it was a woman who had recently lost her eyesight and a gentleman who is her caretaker. And they were living in an encampment along Coyote Creek during the time of the flood. And when they came in, they asked to do 2 separate applications, but if both of them could sit through each application together, because the woman felt so much more comfortable having this gentleman with her because he was such a major part of her life and played such a huge role in her life as she began to lose her eyesight. So I said that if it was okay with both of them and I could get their consent, that it was fine. And it was just incredible to see like how much care that they took of each other. And when they knew one of them was leaving something important out of a question or an answer, how the other jumped in, and they very clearly cared so much more about making sure that the other received assistance than they did about their own. And I think just meeting them and talking to them and hearing their story and seeing the way they really deeply cared about and loved for each other was absolutely incredible.